So I guess my focus being New Zealand young farmers is probably more about what's driving young people in the sector and some of the issues that I think all of us in the rural sector need to consider. I think something that we really need to be aware of is the characteristics of the younger generation that are coming through into the sector and what's driving them. You've got millennials. Many of us are familiar with millennials and what drives them. They tend to want to be collaborative. They're very digitally connected, and that's how they source their information. That's how they want to learn. And it's really important that as employers in the sector, we make an effort to understand how to connect with them and relate to them. Probably of more interest, and one I find fascinating, is Generation Z. So Generation Z is, I have one of those at home, is sort of high school and up to about the age of 24, tend to be at university or working in the early part of their career. And these guys are really driven by sort of a different value set to our generation, or my generation in particular. They kind of have three key things that are driving them and that are really important to them and that they value. And first of all is climate change. So I think as a sector, if we try to sort of think that that's not going to be that much of an issue going forward, I don't think anyone could say that. But for this generation in particular, it is huge. And you've seen the likes of Greta Thunberg, who's the 16-year-old from Europe, who has quit school on Fridays to basically protest what she sees as inaction on climate change. And she's driving a global movement around young people wanting to do something about the effects of climate change. The second thing is inequality. So this generation are not as driven by money and a career as perhaps we were. That is important to them, but it's more of a hygiene factor. They want to be able to connect with issues that are important to them and to have some input into social issues. If an employer doesn't align with their values in that space, then they're unlikely to want to work for them and they'll potentially walk away. And last but not least, and that really drives this Generation Z, is this concept of mental health and well-being and the importance of looking after themselves. And I think more than many generations, they acknowledge the need to do that, and that any work that they do has to support mental health and well-being for them. So if I look at how that sort of translates through to some of the issues we're seeing in the sector, there is very much a talent shortage. Everyone should be pretty much aware that, we struggle in the rural sector or the primary sector to get talent, to get labour. And there's a real urban-rural divide that still exists, where we struggle to get young people, particularly in urban areas, to see primary industries as a sector they want to have a career in. The other issue too is there is some disjointed information around about how to have a career in the sector and how to work in the sector, and also how to access the support that they need to have that career in the sector. So I think that's something that we really need to focus on as an industry. And I think another thing something that young farmers is really passionate about, started off by Terry's when he was in my role, but then very much picked up by us, is the need to nurture young people in the primary sectors. So it's one thing to attract them and it's one thing to connect them, but we need to look after them and we need to keep them in this sector. We need to support them where they have employment issues, and we need to support them with wellness and the ability to make those social connections. So I would suggest that young people today are way more digitally connected than my generation. I mean, when we wanted to talk to someone, when I was a teenager, I had to pick up the phone and actually speak to them. And I often had to speak to their mum or dad first, which was excruciating. And if we wanted to connect socially, we had to do it in person and we had to actually talk. These days, that's not the case. And if young people don't have access to the internet, then they are disconnected. So in New Zealand, we have unacceptable rates of poor mental health and suicide, particularly in rural New Zealand. At Young Farmers, we have a strategy. We want young farmers to be old farmers. So we want to make sure that those young people that are in our sector, that are starting out in their careers, are connected to the resources they need to have that mental health and wellbeing and to get the help they need when they need it. So connectivity is hugely important. I guess the other thing I just wanted to touch on in terms of the context of where we are today is the future of work is going to be very different to what it is now. And how people will learn and how people will look for work is going to be very different, and the primary sector is not immune to that. Future generations will want to be learning all through their lives, and their careers will be less like the traditional path where you go and leave school, you learn for 3 or 4 years, you have a career for 30 odd years, then you retire. There'll be continual learning and upskilling, and potentially 7 or 8 careers, and potentially 20 or 30 jobs even. So access to online learning will be crucial. And also the gig economy, and that's another area that our sector is not immune to, is the fact that it's unlikely that young people today will stay in jobs for long periods of time, and potentially will look for short-term roles and experiences that'll add to their well-being and their wellness. So the importance of being able to access gig work platforms will be crucial as well.